Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas, and today we're going to talk about processing files, which is part 3 in my workflow series for Lightroom Creative Cloud. Let's jump into Lightroom and sort of see how the process of selection and editing starts for me. So the whole process for me for selection, for Lightroom, I'm always opening up into library mode. This is a great module for filtering images, um, for viewing in sort of this grid as I have here, and you can see multiple images at a time to make selections and to begin the process of calling. A few things I want to start out with is talking about library filters. As you notice, normally they're here at the top of my screen. They're missing for now. Hitting the / key is going to allow you to see your library filters. You're going to have a few options. You have text, which you can search quite a number of fields for text that are embedded in the metadata of your files. You also have attributes. Attributes are things like flags, stars, color tags, things like that, as well as, so if you're making virtual copies, master copies, things like that. It's a great option to use for selection. And we'll get back to that in just a second. Metadata is a great filter to use. You start using the camera embedded information, starting out with camera serial number. A lot of times, if you have just camera selected, if you're using multiple Canon 5D Mark IIIs or 1DXs, it'll just show one camera here. So to sort of break up each actual camera shot, I usually tear it down to serial number. Now you can get into all the other camera information like lenses, focal length, flash date. You have access to building these different columns for the metadata filters by dropping down this menu here, and you have a few different options. You have camera info, default columns. We have camera info on right now, and you can actually click on the side here to add a column. Say if I wanted to add ratings as well as labels, just kind of knowing how many rated images I have, and this sort of shows how my images are broke down as well. So sort of moving past this and looking into processing files and looking into more things with the library module, I like to bring up the view mode and just change some of my options for the grid view mode. And so I can hit Command J, and that's going to give me the option for my library view. And so what I can do is I can choose Show Extras, clicking this on and off. And that's actually an option as well that I can do Shift Command H. It's going to hide some of my attributes, my badges. Badges aren't showing right now, but I can show you how to turn those on and off, as well as my flags, my color labels, things like that. I'm going to go back into the view mode, and I have these different options to click on thumbnail badges. Now, thumbnail badges are things like it's showing that this image has been developed or processed, if you will, editing wise. So there's a bunch of options in here. I like to show the file name and the rating and label. That's very important. You also have the same options as well to right click at the bottom of the photo, and you can change that data. Of course, you can click on the file name as well at the very top and bottom. But this is just a dialog box for you to choose some of those actions as well. Moving into loop mode, which is more important for selection, I like to break this down into the loop information too. File name and copy name, exposure, ISO. I usually change this to common photo settings, just so I can get the shutter speed, the aperture, my ISO, focal length, as well as my lens. Another thing I like to bring into the loop information is the camera. So to show my camera as well as my serial number, just to match those kind of things up. You're definitely open to using whatever you want. I just like to sometimes have this some of this sort of tech information readily available if I need it, image to image. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit X on this for now. And what this is going to do is it's going to open us up into a discussion where we're thinking about library mode in grid, or double clicking on an image, and now we have access to it in the loop mode. But what I like to do before I start selecting is I like to get rid of all these panels. So you notice in grid mode you have these kind of distracting panels on the left and right, as well as the film strip at the bottom. So what I like to do is hold Shift and hit Tab. It's just going to get rid of all of that. What you'll notice is if you drag your cursor over to the right, these panels will sort of auto appear. You can right click in these sections and choose manual. And what that does is it only allows it to appear as you click in that section. I like that quite a bit. So once I hide all of my panels, I can move my cursor over there and I don't have to worry about that panel sticking out. So I can actually click there when I need it. It's kind of nice. Same way up here. We can do the same thing with this top panel. Dropping that down. Of course, I can use my / key to get rid of the top library filters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on a file, and I'm sort of set up in this mode here, set up in loop mode. But what I like to do is just clicking on L, it sort of gets rid of everything. So as you notice, if I'm in grid mode and I double click on an image, it gets me into just loop mode here. But if I actually click the L button, it gives me a grid and sort of blacks out the whole background, which I love. It's great for me for when I'm selecting, so I just put a set of headphones on and go to town. And what I like to do when I'm doing my selection is I'm just going through each of these images and I'm waiting. And as you notice, there's not too much of a lag time between them loading. That's a big thing I talked about in the previous article with previews. I'm working with smart previews right now, so I don't have the raws local. But one-to-one previews, smart previews, these are something you definitely want to work with because I'm working with you know, pretty high-end Canon cameras. They're definitely not D800 or 5DSs, cameras, but as far as their loading time, I mean, they're pretty quick for what I'm looking for. And sort of just getting the sharpness down and where it's loading as my computer sort of runs over and over again. Now some of these images are catching up. It's sort of running a little bit slower, but I also have, with the smart previews, I'm a little bit limited in how far I can zoom in. But getting back on track and sort of looking at some of these images, there's a few different options you can do for selection. Let's go back to grid mode and kind of look at the different attributes. Now, when I'm going through these images, let me sort of zoom in on these, and you can use the plus and the minus keys, which is a pretty awesome hotkey for using. So what I like to do is going through these images, say if I wanted to add a flag, I could use the P key, or I can use the U key to unflag it, or the X key to remove the photo or to exclude it. Now, let me go back here. So now if I want to, quickly go through these photos, I also have the option to do Command Up, which is going to give me an option to increase my flag status. So I'm only using my arrow keys, which is kind of nice. I can do arrow down for the rejected, and I can do arrow up for the keeping the flag, and then I can sort of put it back to neutral with no flags, things like that. The nice thing about rejecting photos is it grays them out. So as you start to look at the full view of everything, you can see which photos are best to use, and the grayed out ones kind of fall back. So that's one option with the attributes to use for flags. Another option is you can use the color coding, which I like to use because it's 6 for on, 6 for off. It's one key. I don't have to really think about up, down, or P, U, or X. I can just I'm just clicking on just the numbers, and sometimes I'll just choose, a lot of times I'll just choose the red, which I set up labels for samples usually whenever I'm working. But it just allows me to just choose, whichever files I want to do. So if I'm in loop mode and say I'm selected on an image, I'll just click 6 and it'll show set to red, or I'll click it again and it'll remove the label. I have the same option as well as if I'm cycling between images and I'm holding command, and I can increase the flag status. So as you notice, I can go through these images, and whichever ones I'm picking, I'm looking for the sharp photos. Of course, I wouldn't choose that one. This is much sharper than that image, but that's kind of my process in going through these and sort of just picking out these different images. So getting back to attributes, and another option is you see I have some star ratings as well. The stars work 0 through 5. If I click on this image, if I click 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pretty straightforward. There's going to be star ratings 1 through 5. If I hit 0, it's going to remove all the star ratings. If I hold command and hit the brackets key, excuse me, it's actually going to rotate. If I just hit the brackets key, it's actually going to increase those ratings as well. So I can, that's kind of an option if I just want to lower a star or two. I don't find that option to be that useful, but it's there as well. Just sort of showing out to you the command bracket was the quick rotate for you as well. Sort of did that on accident. So that brings us up into after we selected the job, after we've labeled it however we want, we can start to look at, the images that we're ready to start editing. Um, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bring my panels back in, and I'm going to separate my images out by 5 stars. And the way that I do this workflow is I usually choose about 1,600 images that are just, they're usable images. And then from there, I usually call it down to about 800 that are ones that I'm actually going to focus on for color correction. 1,600 is sort of a digital negatives that you can deliver back to a client, or just the, full res JPEGs that you can send back without edits on them, just so that way they can have their uncle or their aunt or their, cousin that was at the reception, which I don't really care to edit myself, but maybe they want that image and that's family, they want to keep those images in there. So I like to keep those ones and deliver those back to the client as well. Um, so whenever you're looking at these different star ratings, I'm going to go to the 5-star ratings because either these are the ones that I'm going to process for color correction. So in going through sort of starting out with the images, I have an option to start thinking about doing my color correction. Now there's a sort of term or maybe a common phrase you've heard of, and it's sort of it's name dropped as divide and conquer. This is an option where you can actually choose by cameras. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my filters here real quick and actually 5-star everything. So all of my options up here, as you noticed, as I just had the ratings here, I can choose the 5 stars here, but it doesn't really help my columns before that break that down. So by actually doing the 5-star filter, it actually gives me the options where it actually breaks down these different columns, that 860 images that are actually 5-starred. What I can do here is I can choose camera serial number, so it actually breaks it down by camera, and I like to start with the larger camera. And so this kind of gives me a more linear approach to editing the job. Of course, for consistency's sake, it's always best to edit everything together. But just for sort of quick proofing, and I know that both cameras are shooting quite similarly, I don't really have to work the total job together. I can do that at the end when I'm proofing. And we'll get back to that with the quick develop mode and sort of proofing images. But what I like to do is, starting out in the develop panel, I'm going to hit the D key, and we're going to head on over and sort of look at this panel and break it down. So what I like to do is, starting in my before and after phase, and I'm going to put this into a medium gray. It's kind of getting distracting with that black background. But you can right click on the background and choose different color. Of course, if you have white on, that's for your soft proof mode. But not getting ahead of ourselves too much, I like to just have it on the medium gray. And the before and after, and you're going to notice these images are pretty close in the way that they look. That's because I imported these images with the XMPs. So this is actually how you'd be viewing them. Same thing with another image. If I were to reset this, let me flip these around. This actually gives me sort of more of an as edited approach of how the image would look. But what I like to do is, starting out with my 2 panels that I like to have open are the basic settings as well as the camera calibration. Now, camera calibration is very important if you're using Color Monkey color checker profiles for your camera. Those would be listed in here. Camera Standard is a great, sort of Adobe presets profile. It works pretty well. There's also Camera Faithful and Camera Neutral. If you're not too familiar with camera profiles, I think in my second article that I wrote last year, it's my color management article. It's a part 2 where I really get into camera profiles. Definitely check that out. Before sort of messing with these, from Adobe Standard is perfectly fine to leave it in for now. But this is something that you want to change ahead of time, because as you can see, it kind of it adjusts my image tonally and as far as the color gamut and everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this image. I'm back to sort of as shot phase, and we're going to sort of walk through sort of steps and how I would edit. And a lot of people ask me, what's your sort of first adjustment? Where do you start? Are you applying all these creative styles ahead of time, or all these other adjustments in these other panels? And I really like to keep it basic for this first and second step. What I really like to do is apply a preset in library mode to my images. So a lot of times, just as my first step, what I'll do is select all the images, and I'll actually go into my save presets, and it looks like I might not have any presets saved here. Let's see here. Let's go back to develop mode. My normal preset kind of starts out with a +10, minus 15, plus 15, plus 5, minus 10. Kind of similar to this, what you're seeing right here. It's pretty straightforward. It's just sort of a, something that I would apply to all the images in grid mode. I'm just going to go ahead and create that preset right now. Let's just call it starting point. And this sort of brings up another interesting point, a previous article where I'm talking about Lightroom presets. You definitely want to check that out as well. It can be very intuitive to use presets sort of as a first step or second step process. As you know, as I'm not applying any lens correction or any other effects. I want the images to process as quick as possible, just so I can get through the 800 and just get through the color correction, sort of my second step edit after this preset. So I'm gonna go ahead and uncheck all these other options I'm not using. I'm not using white balance or exposure to sync at this point. I'm just gonna go ahead and hit create. And as you notice, we can go back into the library mode, select all the images, and now that preset should show up. It looks like it's going to be under, let's see, it's under user presets. So it should be listed under, there we go. So if I apply my starting point preset to all the images, it's going to get them all to that same stage. Now, a lot of these images have already been processed and edited. This is a completed job, so I'm not going to overwrite all of my settings, but that would be my first step. My second step in the image would be beginning in the basic panel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with exposure. Exposure is very important. I'll brighten it up. You can have the clipping mask on, which is the J key. It's a great key to have on to sort of show your where you're clipping on your histogram here. I'm not going to get into breaking this down sort of into the black point, the shadows, the exposure, and those kind of things in the histogram for now. I just want to get into basic processing or sort of second step processing. So I'm going to bring down the highlights just a bit on the shirt. Do a little more work with the shadows. I think I can open up some of those images. Sometimes I like to turn off the clipping mask just because it's not always helpful, but it can definitely kind of help me get my image a little more a little more even on the exposure. I like to make sure we're exposing the face correctly. And so once I have a good, I like to turn the clarity down when we're working with closer up portraits. What I like to do is once I have my images kind of close to where I want them, at this level here, what I like to do is start to work with my white balance. And so when I'm thinking about the cast of the shirt, these are things that can be taken out in HSL sliders. And we'll get into that in the next article, more advanced editing, of course, with target adjustment tools, those kind of things. But for now, what I'm really just wanting to do is processing these images on a level to where I can actually process the first image and then actually grab all these other ones after it and sync to it. And this is a really quick way for me to sort of process a whole bunch of images together. So I can actually take this 42 image batch and actually select and sync them. And let's see how close they get. And so what I'll do is going to, from each image after that, just make my subtle adjustments. I mean, I'm not trying to make print ready images. I mean, what we're looking to do is to get consistent proof. So you hear those dinging and dinging in the background of these images. And specifically in this job, it hates whenever I don't click into this panel. So the way I'm adjusting in Lightroom is actually just using my cursor with the mouse, as you can see, and my up and down arrows. It's a very simple process for sure, and there's definitely different ways. Some people use MIDI boards and get really high tech and crazy. I'm definitely not one of those people. I use a mouse and the arrow pad for a majority of my editing in Lightroom, just because it's sort of just mundane and robotic to just go up and down. You also have a pretty awesome option where you're just using your keyboard. You can use the period and the / key. Let me go back here. Let me click on this image. Excuse me, the comma and the period key to go up and down. As you can see, the different adjustments that are being highlighted in this panel, and I can actually use the comma key to go up and the period key goes down, and then I can use my right and left arrows. Excuse me, my up and down arrows won't really do anything for me. What you need to use is your plus and your minus key. So as I'm using the comma to go up, the period to go down, I can actually use the plus and minus key to increase contrast as well as increase my exposure. I can drop down some of the highlights. I can go to the lift some of those shadows up, bring back my white point, um, and do some work with the white balance as well. It's a it gets kind of crowded on my laptop that I'm using for this tutorial, but you can definitely use your keyboard for all the edits, and then you could use your thumb and go to the next image and do that same process. So you could bring your highlights up, and it's just a right and left. I'm gonna the plus key is gonna be my increasing my exposure, and I can drop my tint. And just sort of getting used to this functionality. It's kind of interesting, but it gives you it's a all keyboard ready for editing. So those are those are kind of exciting things for Lightroom, whether you knew that or not. What I like to do is once I kind of go through my images and I get them all sort of in line with where I want them to be. I have a few other options as well. I can choose. I can when I'm looking at these images, when I'm proofing, when I'm all done, what I like to do is you can use the quick develop mode. And what's awesome about Lightroom Creative Cloud, and I've talked about this with the upgrade of Creative Cloud from Lightroom 5, is you can actually hold the Shift key now in this quick develop module, and I can get down to a 6th stop, where this used to be just a 3rd stop. So I can actually bring it down in much smaller increments. So when I have to sort of select multiple images, say if I need to select these ones here, I can hold Command and click on them. I can now hold Shift, click on exposure, and just lift that exposure a little bit. And this kind of lets me do a little bit of my proofing in the library mode. So as you see some of my images start changing now, some of them get a little bit too bright. I'll just drop the exposure down a little bit, as well as here. Maybe even bring up my white balance. Let me drop that down so I can warm up that image if I need to. And this is a really good way to go through with proofing when you're looking at all the images together. Once you've gone through both cameras. But that sort of gets us to a stopping point with processing files. There's definitely more advanced editing to come. That will be the next article. But for now, definitely the biggest thing you can do for saving you time and just keeping the quality that you have is it's mechanics. It's the selection process of going through the images, running the smart previews, so that way all the images just load that much quicker. As I'm going image to image here, they're loading now, and they're taking just that half second that they're taking is a little it's a little bit annoying for now. But you look at my last article for previews, building 1:1 previews, where the images are a little bit faster, but they take longer to build. Those kind of things, with mechanics of selection in your process and how you're selecting images, as well as when you're going through these different images in the develop module, and you're making these changes to this first image here, and then you're selecting a handful of images after that and syncing them and sort of watching to see if they change or what you need to do. We can go back in here and just make our adjustments to white balance and exposure and some of the other settings as they're needed, because the lighting's not changing too much. We're going through and we're just pull back on that. These images are already edited, so it's kind of pointless to go back through. But as you can see, when I'm going through the images, I'm trying to keep them as consistent as possible. But the settings don't need to really vary too much. At this sort of proof color correction level. So definitely check out part 4, which is going to be output. So we're going to look at advanced editing, outputting files out of Lightroom, and what you need to do from there. So tune in next week, and we'll look into there.